After months of listening to your ministry, I feel ready to share my story with a wider audience. Some will argue that this contradicts biblical teachings for a variety of reasons. I know this because when I first shared my story with my congregation in 1992, a fifth of its members left. This was a huge loss for me, a small-time pastor at the time, as my congregation numbered 250 individuals. Fortunately, I was able to maintain my position as pastor of my church, but no one, particularly the elders, ever treated me with respect. On that day, I felt obliged to serve. You may almost hear God say, "This is your calling," as if He were sitting next to you. Shortly after graduating from seminary, I was hired as a pastor in a community of 250 people. In this place, I met the woman who would eventually marry me. Throughout the struggle, my wife was a guiding light. Discovering her was like finding a needle in a haystack. She brought happiness and contentment into my life that I had no idea I was missing. I dedicated my life to understanding the mysteries of faith, and our love was as spontaneous and natural as the seasons. She was more than simply my wife. She was my companion in all aspects of my life, including my happiness and grief, victories and disappointments. Cancer descended like a cyclone, leaving no way out. The tempest seemed to be doing havoc on her spirit as well as her body. All it took was a pastor to begin despising God for me to get enthralled. As the woman who had always been there for me battled a disease that no amount of prayer could heal, I stood by helplessly. I began to doubt God's existence during those dark days when I begged Him for her life. My animosity began to grow at this exact instant. Despite the fact that she knew she was dying, my wife continued to believe in the person I suspected of killing her. She would encourage me that I should not become discouraged or have my faith disturbed, having confidence in God and continuing to preach. Although it certainly might, given that God appeared callous to the suffering of the most vulnerable among us, how could I stand before my audience and preach a loving and forgiving God? My prayers felt like murmurs swept away by the wind, undetected and unanswered. After Sarah died, I felt like a lighting turned out. My religion, once a guiding light, faded and then evaporated, sending me into a hole of misery from which I believed I would never recover. I kept my promise to Sarah and fulfilled my obligations, but I was a shell of my old self, only existing to placate a community that continued to seek my advice. There was no trust or hope within me. God intervened in my life at this low point, a watershed moment that altered the course of my existence for all time. As I drove home from church, my mind and emotions were so preoccupied with their internal fight that I missed the unexpected entrance of an automobile. I flew backwards after the impact and slid for about 30 feet before coming to a stop. I recall telling my body to breathe, but my brain's signal failed to activate my lungs no matter how many times I repeated it. At that point, realized I wasn't inside my body at all. I was actually outside of it. To say the least, it was confusing. Was peering about me as the car that had hit me drove away. It's insane to have entire 360-degree vision. Then everything around me darkened, like if I were watching the end credits of a movie. I was struck dead in the stomach by the sudden realization that I had died. Who was I to act as? What would happen to my soul now that I had really questioned the reality of God, the soul, and an afterlife? My spirit has never plummeted, and I have no idea why. I'll never know if it was because I continued to teach God's word despite my own lack of faith in it. However, my spirit was saved from extinction through some means. I was immediately enveloped in a familiar and loving serenity. When Sarah was around, I experienced the peace she had promised. Even before I saw her, I could feel her comforting presence. She was communicating with me through my senses, even though I couldn't see her. She stated she missed me, that this was not the proper time, and that I had to return, even if I didn't want to. When I awoke in the hospital, the world appeared both lighter and darker than I remembered. After getting over Sarah's death, I realized that my ordeal had not been a punishment, but rather a pilgrimage that had brought me back to God. I had somehow survived. While my body recovered, I struggled to understand what had happened during my near-death experience in the weeks that followed. The enormous love and comfort I felt in Sarah's presence remained with me, like a light shining through previously insurmountable shadows in my heart. In light of this incredible encounter, how could I make sense of the God who seemed so distant during my wife's final days? I had an insight while lying in bed, trying to figure out how to do just that. I realized that my faith had been flimsy, like a house built on sand, eroded by life's storms. In the middle of my misery, I experienced the solid ground beneath the sand, the unchanging foundation of a love so vast and ubiquitous that it defied my attempts to measure or fathom it. When I returned to my church the following week, I was a transformed man, both in spirit and purpose. This transformation was on full display in my first sermon after the disaster. I have seen the darkness, I told my flock in the hushed sanctuary, my voice steady but filled with passion. I've seen firsthand how terrible sadness is and how God keeps silent when we face our deepest catastrophes. However, I've also discovered the truth. Even in the depths of sorrow, I've felt the presence of a love that is greater than the darkness. Some members of my church expressed hope, while others were astonished and inquisitive. There was, of course, a quarter who showed complete scorn. What motivates me to be so profane as a pastor? In the weeks and months that followed, I developed a connection with the survivors that I had never felt before. My sermons have evolved from painstakingly organized scriptural lectures to free-flowing conversations of uncertainty, grief, and faith. It was not easy, as I will describe further. In summary, others in the group questioned my background and views, interpreting my seeming lack of orthodoxy as a departure from our religion's long-standing practices. However, there were some people who were moved by my narrative and saw a reflection of their own issues and difficulties. Our church's mood changed with the seasons. It became a haven for the unsure, a sanctuary for the brokenhearted, and a refuge for those in need. As we went together through the mysteries of faith, we built a community united not by our certainty, but by them.